We begin, as we always do, with the plain truth of a life stripped bare. At 34 years old, Clara Whitfield stood on a dirt road outside Ashford Crossing, Dakota Territory, in the autumn of 1887, with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back, a carpet bag of mended dresses, and $9 folded twice inside her glove. It was her husband's brother, Thomas Whitfield, who had put her out, not with violence, but with the quiet cruelty of paperwork, claiming the family farm under a debt she had never seen and a signature she had never made, 3 months after her husband Eli had been buried beneath the cottonwoods. The bank had sided with Thomas. The town had sided with silence. And so Clara walked, with $9 and a grief she carried like a second skeleton beneath her skin, until she came to a notice nailed crookedly to a post at the edge of the county road. The old river crossing at Kettle Bend, abandoned since the flood of '61, to be sold for unpaid taxes to any soul willing to take it. Minimum bid, $8. Everyone in 3 counties called it curse ground, for it was said no one had survived the crossing the night the water rose, and no living person had set foot past its rotted gate in 26 years. Clara bought it anyway, foolish as it seemed, with nearly the last of what she had, because a woman with nothing has little left to lose in owning something everyone else is afraid to touch. She did not know yet that sealed beneath that crumbling toll house was a truth that would not only save her life, but call an entire vanished town back from the silence it had been buried in. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you have ever stood on ground everyone else called worthless and felt, quietly, that it was not, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Clara had not always known the taste of ruin. She had been raised on the northern edge of the Kettle River Valley, the second daughter of a blacksmith named Josiah Reed, a broad, soft-spoken man who believed that iron, like people, revealed its true worth only under pressure and fire. Clara had spent her girlhood at the edge of his forge, not because he wished to make a smith of her, he had a son for that, but because she asked to be there, and Josiah Reed was not a man who turned away curiosity. She learned to read the color of heated metal the way other girls learned to read weather, learned that a blade folded wrong would fail exactly when it was needed most, learned above all that things discarded as ruined were very often only unfinished. Her father used to say that half his trade was not making new tools, but rescuing old ones other men had thrown into the scrap pile too early. And Clara absorbed that lesson so completely it became less a skill than a kind of faith. She grew into a young woman known throughout the valley for a steady hand and a stubborn patience, the sort of patience that could sit with a broken thing for hours without despairing of it. When she married Eli Whitfield at 22, it was not for his prospects, which were modest, but for the way he listened to her the way her father listened to metal, carefully and without judgment. Together they built a small wheat farm on land Eli's father had cleared, and though the years brought no children, they brought a partnership Clara considered richer than most marriages she witnessed around her, one built on shared labor and long, quiet evenings on the porch discussing crop rotations and half-remembered psalms. Eli's younger brother Thomas had always been a different sort of man, quick with a smile and quicker with a debt, prone to schemes that promised much and delivered little. And Eli had spent years quietly covering his brother's failures without ever mentioning it to Clara. Out of some old brotherly loyalty she only understood much later, and far too late. It was this same loyalty, twisted after Eli's death into something closer to entitlement, that would cost Clara everything she had built. But before the fall came, there were 11 good years on that farm, years in which Clara learned to can peaches, to deliver a breech calf with her bare hands, to read the sky for hail before the church bell in town ever told its warning, and to love a stubborn, gentle man who called her his best investment, though she had never had a dollar to her name when they wed. She often thought in later years that her father's lesson about ruined things had been preparing her all along, not for blacksmithing, but for the day she herself would be treated as something used up and cast aside, and would have to prove, quietly and without anyone's permission, that she was not. The fall, when it came, arrived with the particular cruelty of things dressed in respectability. Eli died in the spring of 1887. thrown from a spooked horse while riding fence line, and Clara buried him beneath the cottonwood trees he had planted as saplings the year they married, and grieve in the manner of women who have work waiting for them regardless of sorrow, which is to say, she grieved while still rising before dawn to milk the cow and mend the fence her husband never finished. She might have carried the farm alone. She was strong enough and knew the land as well as Eli ever had. But within weeks, Thomas Whitfield arrived from the county seat with a lawyer, a deed of trust Clara had never seen, and a signature purporting to be Eli's, granting Thomas rights to the farm should Eli die, without surviving children. Rights Thomas claimed had been drawn up quietly 2 years prior, when Eli had once again bailed his brother out of a gambling debt, and Thomas had, in gratitude or manipulation, insisted on some paper assurance for the future. Clara had never seen such a document in 11 years of marriage, and something in her recognized, with a cold certainty she could not prove, that it had been forged or coerced in some manner she would never fully untangle. But she had no money for lawyers, no family standing behind her in a county where the Whitfield name still carried more weight than a widow's word, and the bank, eager to settle any dispute quickly and unwilling to entangle itself in a family quarrel, recognized Thomas's claim within 6 weeks. Clara was given until the first frost to vacate. She sold what she could, the good plow horse, most of the furniture, Eli's tools save for one hammer she could not part with, and still it amounted to little more than enough to survive a season, not rebuild a life. She left the farm on a gray October morning with her carpet bag and $9, having refused, with a dignity that cost her more than anyone knew, to beg Thomas for a single cent more than what the law forced from him. She walked the county road, not toward the town, where pitying looks would have greeted her, but away from it, toward whatever came next, because a woman raised by a blacksmith knows that the only way through heat is forward, never back into the fire that shaped you. It was on that road, 3 miles past the last farmhouse she recognized, that Clara saw the notice for the tax sale of the old river crossing at Kettlebend, and something in her, some old, stubborn instinct inherited from a father who never gave up on scrap metal, made her turn toward the county clerk's makeshift table set up beneath a canvas awning near the crossroads instead of walking past it. The clerk, a thin, nervous young man named Pearlie Vance, seemed almost embarrassed to be conducting the auction at all, for the crossing carried a reputation no one in 3 counties wished to disturb. It had been a thriving river crossing once, he explained, back before the flood of 1861 swept away the ferry, the toll house, and by local legend, every soul who had been sheltering there the night the waters rose, a wagon train of some 14 families bound for the Montana goldfields, caught between a swollen river and a washed-out road. All of them said to have vanished into the current with no bodies ever recovered and no survivors ever found. Since that night, Pearlie said, lowering his voice as though the dead might overhear, no one had wanted the land, not even for the timber standing on it, and the county had simply let the taxes accumulate against an owner who existed now only in memory. Clara looked past Pearlie's shoulder toward the tree line where, faintly, she could make out the sagging silhouette of a structure. The old toll house, she supposed, still standing after 26 years of being left to itself, stubborn as an old nail, refusing to rust through. Something about that stubbornness spoke to her more plainly than any words Pearlie could offer. She bid $8, the minimum, half expecting someone else to raise it and save her from her own foolishness. But no one did, and within the hour Clara Whitfield owned 22 acres of cursed, waterlogged ground and a crumbling toll house that not a soul in the county would set foot inside. She walked to it that same afternoon because she had nowhere else to be and no other roof waiting for her. The path down to the river had gone wild with sumac and wild rose, the old ferry road barely visible beneath a quarter-century of unchecked growth, but the toll house itself, when she finally stood before it, surprised her with its stubborn solidity, log walls gray with weather but sound, a stone chimney still standing true, a roof sagging in one corner but largely intact, as though the building had simply been waiting, patient as her father's discarded iron, for someone willing to see what remained rather than what had been lost. Inside, dust lay thick over an old table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth, and a narrow bed frame stripped of its ticking. Everything arranged as though whoever had last kept this house had simply stepped out one evening and never returned. It was in clearing the hearth of 26 years of nesting swallows and fallen soot that Clara's hand struck something that did not belong among ash and stone. A loose brick, set slightly proud of its neighbors, which came free with only a little coaxing to reveal a shallow cavity behind it, and within that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, a small leather-bound ledger and a single iron key, far too ornate for any door Clara could see in that humble house. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the oilcloth fully, not from cold, though the evening had turned sharp, but from the particular thrill of a woman who has spent her whole life rescuing things others discarded too soon, finally standing at the edge of a discovery that felt larger than herself. The ledger's first page, in a careful, sloping hand, read simply, "Property of Sister Miriam Calloway, keeper of the Crossing Chapel. This book begun the spring of 1858. Clara sat back on her heels in the gathering dark, the key cool and strange in her palm, and understood, with the same certainty her father had taught her to feel in the color of heated iron, that the crossing had not been abandoned quite so completely as the county records or the frightened whispers of 3 counties believed. Over the following days, as Clara set about making the toll house livable again, patching the roof with split shingles she fashioned herself, scrubbing the hearth, hauling river water for washing, she read Sister Miriam Calloway's ledger by firelight each evening, and slowly the shape of a hidden history rose up out of the dust like a photograph developing in a chemical bath. Sister Miriam, it emerged, had not been a nun in any formal sense, but a widowed missionary teacher who had settled at Kettlebend in the 1850s and built, with the help of the Ferry families, a small clapboard chapel a quarter-mile upriver from the crossing itself, a chapel whose bell, cast, the ledger noted with evident pride, from melted-down cookware and a single donated church bell from back east, had called the scattered river settlements to worship every Sunday and, more importantly, had served as the community's flood warning, rung by whoever kept the chapel whenever the water rose dangerous in the night. The ledger recorded years of births, marriages, small debts forgiven, seed shared in lean seasons, and the quiet, unglamorous work of holding a community together at the edge of the frontier. But the entries grew sparser and more anxious as they approached the spring of 1861, filled with worried notes about a land agent named Cornelius Vane, representing Eastern Railroad interests, who had been pressuring the river families for months to sell their claims cheaply, claims that sat squarely along a proposed rail spur to the goldfields, and who had grown increasingly hostile when the families, organized and encouraged by Sister Miriam, refused to sell for less than fair value. The final entries, dated the very week of the flood, described threats Clara found chilling even a quarter-century removed from them. Veiled warnings that the crossing was dangerous ground, that misfortune had a way of finding stubborn settlers, that Cornelius Vane had begun buying up tax liens on properties whose owners might, in his words, unexpectedly fail to survive the season. The ledger ended abruptly, mid-sentence, on the night of the flood itself, and Clara understood, turning that final brittle page in the firelight, that she was holding not merely a record of lost town, but very possibly a record of the last hours before a massacre disguised as a natural disaster. The key, she discovered on the 4th day, opened nothing in the toll house itself, but fit a heavy padlock she found, after considerable searching through the overgrown grounds, securing the door of a root cellar dug into the hillside behind where the chapel must once have stood, its clapboard walls long since collapsed and swallowed by blackberry bramble, leaving only a fieldstone foundation to mark where it had been. Inside the root cellar, dry despite the years and protected by the hill above it, Clara found what Sister Miriam Calloway had clearly hidden in her final desperate hours. Not gold, though there was some coin among the contents, but something Clara recognized as far more valuable to the families who had once lived here. A strong box of original land claims and survey documents for every family along the crossing, along with a second, more personal ledger detailing what had truly happened the night of the flood. In her own trembling hand, in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. Sister Miriam had written that the flood that spring had indeed been real and dangerous, but that most of the wagon families had in fact survived it, guided by Miriam herself and the ferryman, a man named Obadiah Fret, to high ground well before the worst of the water arrived, thanks to a warning Miriam had rung on the chapel bell hours before the crest. What had drowned that night? Miriam wrote with what Clara could feel, even across 26 years, was Cornelius Vane's patience. For with the crossing declared a disaster site and its families scattered to relatives in other territories, too shaken and too poor to fight a land claim from a distance, Vane had quietly purchased the abandoned parcels through the county for pennies on the dollar. Then let the rumor take root and grow on its own that no one had survived at all. A rumor that discouraged any family from ever returning to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, since it would come back to ground haunted by their own supposed deaths. Miriam had hidden the original land claims specifically so that Vane's fraudulent purchases could one day be challenged, intending to travel to the territorial land office herself once the flood's danger had passed. But the ledger's final entry, dated barely a week after the flood, recorded that Miriam had fallen ill with a fever common along the river bottoms that season, and feared she would not recover in time. She had rung the chapel bell one final time, she wrote, not as a flood warning, but as a message to Obadiah Fret and any surviving family who might hear it and understand. The crossing was not lost, only waiting, and the truth was hidden safe behind a loose brick and beneath the chapel hill for whoever proved patient enough and honest enough to find it. Clara sat in that root cellar for a long while after finishing the second ledger, the strong box open before her, understanding with a clarity that felt almost physical that she had not simply purchased a cursed and abandoned crossing for $8. She had purchased, unknowingly, the buried conscience of an entire vanished town, and the means, perhaps, to finally give it back. The trouble, as Clara soon discovered, was that Cornelius Vane's grandson, a smooth and comfortable man named Silas Vane, had inherited both his grandfather's original parcels and his grandfather's instinct for pressing an advantage. Silas had been quietly expanding his holdings along the Kettle River for years, consolidating old tax lien properties into what would soon become, with the rail spur finally under construction after decades of delay, one of the most valuable stretches of river frontage in the territory, and Clara's small, forgotten purchase of the old crossing sat directly athwart a right-of-way he had assumed, reasonably enough given 26 years of undisturbed ownership, would simply fall to him, uncontested whenever the county finally cleared its books. When word reached him, as word does in small counties, faster than any letter, that a widow named Whitfield had bought the crossing and was asking old-timers in Ashford about a woman called Sister Miriam and a ferryman named Fret, Silas Vane rode out to the crossing himself within the week, arriving in a fine buggy that looked entirely wrong parked among the wild rose and sumac, and offered Clara, with the easy condescension of a man accustomed to being obeyed, $40 for the parcel. 5 times what she had paid, he pointed out, as though this generosity should settle the matter immediately. Clara, who had spent her whole life learning to recognize the difference between a fair offer and a frightened one, declined politely and watched something harden behind Silas Vane's pleasant face that told her the offer would not remain generous for long. Within days, rumors began circulating through Ashford that the widow Whitfield was disturbing an old grave site, that she had been seen digging near the chapel ruins at odd hours, that perhaps the crossing's old curse had found new blood to feed on. Rumors Clara recognized, with a chill, as the same tactic that had scattered the original families a generation before, dressed now in new clothes. Pearlie Vance, the nervous young clerk, was quietly instructed by his superiors at the county office to review whether the original tax sale to Clara had been properly conducted, a review that dragged on for weeks and threatened, Clara understood, to simply void her ownership through bureaucratic exhaustion rather than open confrontation. She had no lawyer, no standing family name, and $9 long since spent on shingles and flour. What she had was a strong box of original claims, 2 ledgers written in a dead woman's careful hand, and a stubbornness her father had forged in her, before she was old enough to know she was being shaped at all. It was the second ledger's final pages that gave her the idea that would, in the end, unmake Silas Vane's quiet campaign more thoroughly than any lawyer could have managed. Sister Miriam had recorded not only the flood and the fraud that followed, but the names and, where she knew them, the eventual destinations of every family who had scattered from the crossing that spring. The Halversons to a cousin's farm near Bismarck, the Ostrander family to relatives in Iowa, the widow Petra Solberg and her 3 sons to her sister's household in Minnesota, and Obadiah Fred himself, the ferryman, to his brother's fishing operation on Lake Superior, still living, so far as Miriam had last heard before her fever worsened, as recently as 1885. Clara spent nearly all of what little money she had left on postage and telegrams that autumn, writing to county clerks and church registries in each of those distant places, asking after descendants of the crossing families, and enclosing with each letter a careful, honest account of what she had found, along with an invitation, not a demand, for she was not a woman who demanded, to come see for themselves what still stood at Kettle Bend, and what still by rights belonged to them. The first to answer was not a Halverson or an Ostrander, but Obadiah Fret's granddaughter, a sharp-eyed young woman named Ruth Fret, who had grown up on stories of a river crossing her grandfather refused to speak of except late at night, when he thought no one listening, and who arrived at Ashford in early November with her grandfather's own trembling but unmistakably eager letter clutched in her gloved hand. For Obadiah, 81 years old and nearly blind, had wept upon hearing Clara's letter read aloud and had dictated, word for word, his own account of the night of the flood, confirming everything Sister Miriam's ledger had recorded and adding details of his own. How Cornelius Vane had come to him personally in the flood's aftermath and offered him money to simply disappear northward and never speak of what he knew. An offer Obadiah, frightened and grieving and utterly without recourse, had taken. Ruth Fret's arrival and the quiet, devastating honesty of her grandfather's confession was the first crack in the story Silas Vane's family had allowed to calcify into local legend for 26 years, and it would not be the last. Within a month, a Halverson grandson arrived from Bismarck with his own family's old deed, preserved in a family Bible for a generation, though none of them had understood its significance. An Ostrander granddaughter wrote from Iowa, asking for particulars before she made the long journey herself. And the whole quiet, patient machinery Clara had set in motion with a handful of postage stamps began grinding forward with a momentum no land agent, however comfortable, could easily arrest. Silas Vane did not surrender easily. He hired a lawyer from the territorial capital who argued, with considerable polish, that 26 years of undisturbed possession settled any question of ownership regardless of how that possession had originally been obtained, and for a tense stretch of the winter, it seemed entirely possible that a courtroom in the county seat, more sympathetic to a prosperous landowner than to a widow and a scattering of returning families, might simply rule the whole matter closed by the passage of time. But Clara had one advantage Silas Vane's polish could not erase. She had Sister Miriam's ledgers, written in real time by a woman with no reason to lie and every reason, given her illness, to record the truth plainly for whoever came after her. She had Obadiah Fret's dictated confession, sworn before a Minnesota notary and corroborated independently by the very payment Cornelius Vane had made him, a payment Obadiah had kept record of in his own household accounts for reasons he could no longer entirely explain, except to say some part of him had always known the truth would matter someday. And she had, gathering week by week through that winter, an entire community of returning descendants whose combined testimony painted a picture no territorial judge could comfortably dismiss as coincidence. The hearing, when it finally came in the early spring of 1888, was less a legal battle than a slow, public unveiling of a fraud a generation old, and when the territorial judge, a careful, unhurried man named Judge Amos Pruitt who had, Clara later learned, lost his own father to a similarly convenient land seizure decades before in a different territory entirely, finally ruled. He did not merely restore Clara's $8 purchase to her. He voided, parcel by parcel, every tax lien claim Cornelius Vane had fraudulently obtained along the old crossing, restoring each family's original claim to their rightful descendants, wherever those descendants could be found and wished to reclaim what had been theirs. It was on the evening the ruling was finally read aloud in the county seat, as the returning families and Clara herself rode back together toward Kettle Bend in a slow procession of wagons and borrowed horses, that something happened which no one present that day has ever been able to explain by any means but the simplest one, which is that some debts, honestly settled, seemed to ring out on their own. As the procession crested the last hill above the crossing, with the sun sitting low and gold over the river, the bell that Ruth Frett and several of the Halverson men had spent the preceding weeks quietly restoring, having found it, dented but whole, still hanging in the collapsed chapel's fieldstone foundation exactly where Sister Miriam's ledger said it would be, and having rigged a simple new frame to hold it upright once more, began to ring across the water, struck not by any hand, for no one had yet climbed to it that evening, but by the same wind and current mechanism Sister Miriam herself, ailing and desperate, had rigged in her final failing days to sound a message to anyone who might one day return and listen. It rang out clear and low across the Kettle River in the falling light, exactly as it must have rung 27 years before, calling scattered families home, and every person in that procession, whether they believed in signs or not, felt something in their chest ease at the sound of it, as though a debt held too long had finally, at long last, been paid in full. We return, as we must, to where we began, to a woman of 34 with $9 in her glove, standing before a crumbling toll house everyone else had called cursed, buying it not out of hope, but out of stubbornness she had not yet learned to name. Clara Whitfield had lost a husband, a farm, and the good name a family had once lent her, cast out by a man who mistook cruelty for entitlement, and she had believed, walking that gray October road, that she was simply surviving one more day with what little remained to her. She could not have known that the cheapest, most despised parcel of land in 3 counties held within it not merely a hidden fortune, but a hidden conscience, a community's stolen history waiting patiently, brick by brick and ledger by ledger, for someone with the particular patience to rescue discarded things rather than dismiss them. What Clara restored at Kettle Bend was never, in the end, about the coin in that root cellar strongbox, most of which she distributed among the returning families who needed a fresh start more than she did. It was about the plain, quiet justice of giving people back what had been taken from them under cover of tragedy, and about proving in the process that a woman written off by her own family as finished could become the very hand that finished, at last, an old and patient wrong. The crossing today is no longer called cursed. It is called, by the families who returned to farm its river bottoms once more, simply Miriam's Bend, and a small clapboard chapel stands again near the old foundation, its bell ringing every Sunday evening at sunset, not as a warning any longer, but as a plain and steady reminder that nothing honestly hidden stays lost forever, if someone is willing to listen for it. Thank you for spending this evening with Clara Whitfield and the families of Kettle Bend. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people so often hold more worth in the world as willing to admit. We'll leave you tonight with a question to sit with, the way Clara once sat with a locked ledger by firelight. What is something in your own life, or in someone else's, that others wrote off too soon, but that you suspected quietly still had value left in it? Tell us, if you like, in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.